listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How you doing?
Not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing good, and I'm gonna just expose you, man. You've got the best podcast set up now. I think you need to share with our loyal listeners what you got going on.
Well, that's not fair because there are way better podcast people out there, right? I am definitely no Joe Rogan, but yeah, I've made some investments in microphone and mixer. So yeah, our voices, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending on how you look at it, are the product. So I try to, make sure that we sound as palatable as possible if I can.
Well, Jeff, I know one thing about you. This is a device journey, right? You've kind of gone in, and right now you've got like the entry level Tesla, but it won't be long until you're driving like the top end with all the features enabled.
Yeah, I think I'm getting maybe more towards the top end at this point. It's definitely some equipment purchases have been made recently to up the ante, at least on my side. I think the challenging part is we're still going over Zoom, so there's only so good that it can be as we record these, and I think we're looking at other alternatives, to maybe kind of up everyone's sound quality. But yeah, I mean, it's a journey. I would say in the Tesla scheme, I'm probably sitting at a Model 3, Model Y performance edition. I wouldn't say I'm at the S or the X or even the Roadster, but I'm pretty comfortable with where I'm at. I don't see any upgrades for a while after what I've done this last couple of weeks.
All right, Jeff, more exposure. So how many cell phones do you have?
Right now I only have one, but I certainly will try out several throughout the year because I like to try out Android as much as I can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the investment in podcast equipment, I think is the timing is good, right? You mentioned to me we're up to over 2,000 listens per month. I mean, shout out not to you and I, shout out to our listeners who keep downloading and keep reaching out to us and letting us know that they're enjoying the content. And shout out to our guests for making that content fantastic.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. It's amazing to see the growth over the last, we're not even 1.5 years old, at this point. So we're somewhere in that area. And yeah, the growth has been exponential. It's been cool. Hopefully people are enjoying it. And if people are listening because they're forced to, I'll take it too. That's fine with me. As long as people are listening and subscribing, that's what helps us. Why don't we talk a little bit about Identity Management Day? Because that's coming up. And I know that, I guess by the time people listen to this, it'll be next week. So Identity Management Day is April 13th. That is something that Jim and I fully support. It's a great way to get recognition out there for people in the IAM space, and they're doing a lot to kind of drive awareness for it, which is fantastic. You can visit identitymanagementday.org for more information, and we've also got a handy little click button that I've put up on our website at identityatthecenter.com. So lots of easy ways to get into that. Jim, what are you most excited for Identity Management Day?
I think for the podcast that we're going to do the day before is one thing that I think is exciting. So if you tune in, download on April 12th, we're going to have two of the folks. I won't reveal the identities yet of those folks, but we're going to have some guests who are going to, from the organization sponsoring Identity Management Day. And I think it'll be an exciting listen.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to get some folks who are tied into it and kind of celebrate where things are at. So that's coming up in the future. Definitely want to keep an eye out for that. And I guess mark your calendars if that's such a thing that people still do. Why don't we get into the topic for today? Because this is, I think this is really interesting. I think we're going to have a good conversation, and it's really talking about workforce planning from an identity and access management perspective. And we've got as a guest today, Ken Myers. He's a doctoral student at Marymount University, and he's focusing on IAM workforce planning. So why don't we get into it with Ken? Hey, Ken, how you doing?
Hey, afternoon, guys. How you doing today?
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a lot to kind of unpack today, but we have our traditional first question. Every time someone comes on the show, we'd like to know, how did you get into the IAM space? Is it something that you chose, or did you choose it?
Honestly, I think it chose me. Actually, I joined the Marine Corps right out of high school. So I was an enlisted Marine for almost a decade. I was in aviation communications. We're using military specific equipment, which got replaced by Cisco networking. So that was really how I got into IT. And then I was also on a special security guard program doing physical security. And actually that is where I got introduced to identity proofing. So actually that was my entrance way into identity access management. So it was badging, credentialing, identity proofing. And then after the Marine Corps, I'm actually from the DC area, and the government has a large presence, obviously, in the DC area. And so I did predominantly a lot of government contracting and a lot of policy work around identity and access management and for workforce identities with the government. And I mean, right now, I'm an IT specialist with the General Services Administration. And if you're not familiar with the General Services Administration, it's a U.S. federal government agency that manages and provides government-wide services, predominantly to the U.S. federal government, but also to state and local agencies. So if you think about public buildings, commodity services like IT services, but also a lot of coordination around the government. So, for example, if the Office of Management and Budget comes out with a policy, usually GSA is the one that helps coordinate it, depending on what the scope of it is. But that was my entry point into identity and access management.
So it sounds like you're definitely coming at it more from the operation side of things. And I think the GSA is pretty interesting. I guess the way that in my simple brain, I kind of think of it as a shared service for the government. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's pretty close. I mean, it's interesting that the GSA is the only government agency that's allowed to offer government-wide contracts. So, if you think it from like the private sector, right? If you think about enterprise IT services are usually run out of an IT shop, consolidating and saving money. That's really what the GSA is trying to do, is save the government money.
I know that one of the things that comes up as part of the work you're working on is this concept of ICAM, or identity, credential, and access management. Is that basically the same thing as IAM, just the government spin on it, or is that something that's different?
That's a good question. I mean, something I've noticed in the government space is they love sticking an F in front of acronyms. So like ICAM or FICAM, federal ICAM, or federal something else. But yeah, I mean, ICAM is just another way of saying IDM with the focus on the C part, which is the credential part. So within the government, they issue a PKI-based smart card called a personal identity verification card, the PIV card, and that's been like the scope of government identities for a long time. So very little difference between ICAM and IAM, really.
It still boils down to who has access to what, right?
Yeah.
And make sure that's appropriate.
So Ken, I think it's fascinating that you're working on your doctorate. We've had past doctoral candidates. We had David Douay with the Open Measures Project, who was working on his doctorate. He was back in episode, I'm just looking at my notes, episode 62 for those folks who want to go back and listen. We've had Dr. Chase Cunningham on, and it's funny because I always like to say, this person's a PhD, kind of jokingly, this person's a PhD in access management or something like that, because I think that indicates like expertise, deep focus on a specific area. And I'm wondering kind of what is it that you're working on? What are you researching specifically within your doctorate? And then maybe you can walk us through what that whole process looks like.
Yeah, definitely. So actually the doctoral process of writing a dissertation is honestly pretty similar to what writing a white paper or any other kind of researched writing, right? You identify a gap, you look at existing work around it. I mean, hopefully you can find peer-reviewed sources, and usually in those papers, it may list gaps in their own research. And then from there, you can pretty much combine existing knowledge to create new knowledge. I mean, that's really what it is you're creating new knowledge, you're furthering the space. One of the interesting things I found when I was researching identity access management for peer-reviewed papers was in the last decade, the majority of papers I found were all about federated identities using federation protocols, the security around using federation assertions, And then more recently, I would say decentralized identities. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I'm wondering, does that fall in line with your mind of where the latest identity and access management research should be?
You know what, I'm seeing a lot of new models around using artificial intelligence and kind of tying new capabilities in that space back to IAM. So looking at behavior and how do you apply that to say somebody's acting abnormally and then kicking off the process. So to me, that's one of the areas that I find would be really interesting to research. But I think the use case that you're talking about that's one that's here and now, and almost everybody that we work with or talk to, they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis is dealing with the federated identity model. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
The goal here, right, is to have as few as logons as possible, right? And get the single sign-on, and federation definitely comes into that. I think companies still struggle a little bit, depending on where they're at from a maturity standpoint of external federation, allowing external IDPs into their organization, which sounds very cool in theory, but I think there is a lot of, sometimes angst and the desire to have control, right, over some of these accounts and what they get access to. But I'm starting to see some inroads with that, and certainly on the decentralized identity, I think we've constantly talked a little bit about blockchain and identity, and I've yet to see a good enterprise use case. I definitely see more of a use case in the public sector, especially things around government, citizen type functions, maybe academia or health, those types of areas. But still searching for something on the enterprise side that where a decentralized identity makes sense, and maybe that's just not the right way to look at it.
So I would say two things, two things that tripped me up while I was doing my research was the using the right words, right? Similar in the government space, they say ICAM. Outside the government, they say IAM. They say Federated Identity Management, or FIM, right? There's lots of different words. So that was the first thing. To your second point, part of the dissertation process is identifying gaps. And then figuring out which one is the most interesting and most feasible to research from that perspective. So if it checks both of those boxes, you might have a winner. And so I came up really with 6 topics. Decentralized identities wasn't really one of them, honestly. One was looking at identity frameworks and models in other countries and seeing how effective they are. So for example, in Canada, they have a pan identity framework, which was interesting. Japan uses kind of like a bridge PKI model for national identities. You have the EID in Europe. You have I think it's ADVAR in India. And so each one has their own kind of characteristics that fit within their culture. So it's almost like a cultural study of how identity is used in other parts of the world, which was interesting. That one was a little hard to research. So one topic, and the topic that I picked, which was close to home, which I find as a major challenge as an identity professional, is finding good identity and access management people to join my team, right? And classic example is an entry-level cyber analyst with 10 years of experience in the CISSP, right? I mean, have you guys seen that too?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So one of the areas I actually worked in heavily was public key infrastructure. And it was always a challenge finding a public key infrastructure person, because it seemed like public key infrastructure experience always came after 20 years of something else, right? So my research topic is developing an identity and access management competency model. It's focused on the US federal government to hire, train, and retain identity and access management professionals. And even though I'm tailoring it to the US federal government, there's very little difference in how the government implements identity with the private sector. I mean, the minor differences might be, which security framework or which methodology is implemented, but it's still, you need to verify your identity. They need to access something. They need to be authorized to access it. I mean, the principles are pretty much the same across the board.
I think it's a really interesting topic, because on one hand, you've got the federal government of the U.S. seems to be one of the richest targets for hackers, right? So you have the highest need to have cybersecurity and IAM professionals. And on the other hand, I think government has a reputation for paying the lowest. And maybe that's not the maybe that's not the way it is anymore, but more that you have kind of lifelong security and you have a fantastic pension plan, great benefits, but that the pay is less than maybe what you get in the corporate environment. And I've always wondered how the government goes about attracting, retaining that talent. And kind of in my mind, the life cycle has been you bring in people early, and people who are kind of smart people, maybe have some base level of skills and kind of build them up, and that you're hoping that they get kind of locked into that big picture of, hey, I've got a great pension program here. It's a really good life that I built. And now you have somebody who's got that experience and is going to stick with your organization over the long term. I don't know if what I said there is like totally false, but at least that's the impression that I've gotten.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the reason why I decided to focus specifically on the federal government is one, another aspect of finishing a dissertation is having it scoped in a way that you can finish it, right? And that's based on, you usually pick your scoping on available resources. Now, luckily, the US government, all of their workforce planning documentation is publicly available. So that makes it easy to see how one industry, one sector looks at cyber workforce planning. Outside of the government, and you may find specific, or you may find guidance for specific industries, but it's not as readily available as maybe going to the Office of Personnel Management, searching for cybersecurity workforce and seeing that they have a strategy right there. In my research, I had difficulty finding a similar strategy tailored to an industry in the same manner.
What does the decision process look like in terms of when you want to build a team with employees versus using a contractor?
I mean, obviously, I would say in general, right? Not government specific, but also in the private sector, looking at what knowledge you want retained within the organization. So usually, your enterprise architects, your program managers, they may be employees of the company or the agency because they have the knowledge and the vision to implement what the executives want to do. And then it could just be based on price or talent, right? What is the most optimal path to implementing that executive's goal, that corporate mission that you're trying to achieve? Is it, paying a little bit more and getting short-term resources to achieve it faster? Or is it more of a long-term, we're going to hire some full-time employees to be able to maintain it?
Right. So it sounds very, very similar to kind of how corporations approach that same problem.
Yeah, sometimes it's, I think, by necessity, right? If you can't find employees, then either the work doesn't get done, right, and you just don't have it taken care of, or you look into the non-employee market, whatever that looks like, contractors, vendors, et cetera, right, to bring in those types of resources to help get things going rather than waiting around. I think this is it's an interesting topic because workforce planning, when it comes to the IAM side of things, can mean so much. And it's a lot of work, right? I know you're doing it for the dissertation. What is the other effort that kind of puts this in front of it as well? I think of things like organizations who have a challenge with trying to find those resources. How do they articulate? What are they looking for? So, you can say PKI, right? And then some HR person is going to have to probably do the first pass and screening, and somewhere there's going to be a disconnect, right? So helping write job descriptions that make sense, for example, might help with the effort of that. Are there other things that could be playing a part for that?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, within the United States, so there's a public-private partnership through the National Institute for Science and Technology, or NIST, called the National Initiative for Cyber Education, or NICE. NIST. NIST, NICE is the acronym there. And that actually came out a couple of years ago, and their mission was to create a workforce plan that identified specific work roles, identified tasks, knowledge, and capabilities or abilities. And what I found was within the NIST NICE, it called out specific identity and access management tasks, but they were spread out across multiple work roles, which, and, if you take a step back and you look at it, that's really how the industry views identity and access management, right? They see it as an important piece to security, but it's just a part of everything. I mean, have you noticed that as well?
Yeah, it's so important we don't dedicate anyone to it, right? You wear multiple hats. It's a
Right.
foundational part of security, but I think this is something that we're starting to see experts and specialists in IAM field, and usually they're part of an infosec group, or at least have an infosec background to some degree. So yeah, I mean, I think it's always a challenge of trying to justify headcount is always an issue, right? Especially in the times that we're in now, which I hate that phrase, in the times we live in. But it is a reality of the situation where a lot of organizations have contracted over the last year due to the pandemic, and budgets are tight. So trying to unwind that, I think, will be relatively slow. I don't see this massive, okay, the pandemic's over and now everyone's back to work, right? I think organizations have now lived with it for a year, and it probably does mean people wearing multiple hats, and that sometimes includes identity and access management work. It may be split between a bunch of different groups. Is it ideal? No, but this is the world we live in, and it's never ideal. So I think I think it's just a reality of how IAM staffing works.
Yeah, I mean that was pretty apparent from some of the peer-reviewed papers that I've looked at, and also some of the challenges that I identified. So the 2020 Verizon data breach investigations report, right? Two out of the top three breaches were credential theft and phishing. I mean, in my mind, both of those are related to identity access management, right? And the way you usually mitigate those is through multi-factor authentication, or MFA. Now, who is implementing that MFA, right? Is it an identity access management person, or is it someone? Is it like a developer? Because the developer maintains the platform, and then you just load a module on there. So it really is that. I mean, that's kind of one of the research questions I'm looking at: is what is the chicken and what is the egg? Are the vulnerabilities due to people not trained on identity and access management, or is it that we don't have identity and access professionals doing identity and access management work? I mean, something else. I mean, recently, right? Zero trust is real big. You see a lot of companies and vendors specifically talking about zero trust, talk about identity as the new perimeter. Identity governance is mentioned in the NIST 800-207 as an approach to zero trust. I mean, have y'all heard of this new phrase, identity is the new perimeter too?
I've heard this new phrase, identity at the center. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We're at the center and the perimeter.
It's the only thing really that's constant, right? I mean, people shift locations all the time. The only thing that's not changing is people, right? But people change. But yeah, that's where we see a lot of structure and guidance now around is how do you protect the person and the resource. And that's, I think, where zero trust comes in very well, is you can't always assume that people on your network are good, right? And
yep.
And that's where you want to make sure you've got the right access controls in place and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, two of the things that we like to say all the time, right, is one, hackers don't break in, they log in. And when you're talking about that zero trust, the identity is the new perimeter, what's that all about? Is that just because somebody's on the inside of the firewall doesn't mean they're safe. I think it was the Verizon data breach report where we got the stat that roughly a third of all breaches, the main actor is an internal actor. That doesn't even get to the idea that the external actor eventually gets into the network. So really, identity is at the center. It really is the perimeter, because the perimeter breaks down, and it certainly is still important, but it can't be relied on as the main or the only control.
Yeah, I mean, and to Jeff's point earlier, from workforce planning perspective, I mean, this kind of squarely falls on in the human resources area. So that's definitely one of the main stakeholder groups that I'm looking at. So the three angles I'm taking with my research is look at peer-reviewed papers specifically on cyber workforce planning. It's kind of interesting to point out that a couple that I found highlight the difference between an academic trained cybersecurity person and the needs of an organization, and there's usually like a disconnect. So if you if you've looked at like a job openings or job postings for identity and access management or even cybersecurity people, you might see a certification line in there, right? They're looking for a CISSP, a CISM, or a CEH, right? A certified ethical hacker. And if you're familiar with all three of those, they are very different. So it's like, I'm just going to throw some acronyms out there and see what I'm going to see what I can get, right? And same thing from the degree side. At least now it seems like companies are recognizing experience without a degree. And there's the variety of degrees that would fall within that, right? Some of the ones I've seen, cybersecurity, which is relatively new, but if you remember information assurance, information security, IT management, or even business management, right? Such a wide variety of knowledge, and between those, it's kind of interesting. I mean, from y'all's experience, have you noticed the same? Have you noticed like a difference between certifications that you're asking for, or even academic education?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually, I have some personal history with this because I went to college for a liberal arts degree. And when I was in my third year of college, I realized I want to get into computers. Well, it was a little too late to start over. So I finished out my liberal arts degree, and then I went and got a job where I was working on computers, and I worked and got my Microsoft certification. This was before the days of Active Directory to kind of date myself here. But I remember talking to my mother-in-law who said, you need to go back and get a computer science degree. She was an HR professional, right? But the reality of it was that there was a shift taking place, and you could learn just as much going through those certification programs about a specific technology, which is usually what organizations are looking for, is people who really know something specific. And certification was a great way to go about doing that, right? Universities are so expensive. To go back and redo my degree in computer science would have been such a major effort, such a major expense. I was able to get into an enterprise IT environment doing the Microsoft networking stuff. It was hot at the time, and it let me learn how enterprise computing took place, right? And then you kind of move laterally or move up, you take different opportunities, and then you build a career that way. So to me, you need to kind of arm yourself with whatever makes sense, right? I'm not saying a degree isn't valuable. Certainly if you're starting college right now and you're interested in computers, I would recommend computer science or information technology or even something more specific. But if you didn't go that route, I wouldn't say it's too late, right? Get your foot in the door, find opportunities, manage projects, learn whatever technologies you can to kind of position yourself so that then you can continue to gather certifications, continue to build your resume, and become that valuable resource.
Yeah, and I think this is where Jim and I are a little bit of an odd couple. we come from different backgrounds, and we've talked about this before on the show. But I started off in restaurants, right? So I was a busboy, a server, a bartender, bar manager. Did all that stuff, and I did that for a long time before I really got into IT. And I started off in a help desk, and that was my first taste of IT, and kind of moved up and over into information security, and then moved into specifically IAM as part of that role. But I went to college for, I think, a total of, I don't know, maybe 30 days before I decided it wasn't for me. I think I aced an economics test and then stopped going. And I think I ended up with one college credit for economics with, just passing that one. That was it. But I knew very early on that, formal training and education really wasn't where I was going to be the most successful. And it's not that I'm a bad student or anything like that. I mean, I did fine in high school, you know, all that good stuff. It just, the college life wasn't for me. So I entered the workforce right away, and I've basically learned everything that I know on the job and self-study and tinkering. And I've always been, you know, the guy building the computers on their own. And, you know, I remember my dad giving me a, you know, it's like, well, you bought Wing Commander. This would have been back in the, I guess, the early 90s. We're on floppy disk at this point. And, you know, if I wanted to play it, I had to figure out how to make it work, which meant building a computer, installing Visa drivers, and figuring out the difference between, you know, the different types of x86 processors, and whether I had the DX with the math coprocessor, which was awesome, right? And meant I could have better frame rates. And I remember I spent 8 hours installing Wing Commander on that machine. It was so slow. And I was so excited, and that was kind of, it hooked me. So I had that background. I just didn't have the formal education. And, you know, my personal philosophy and mission has been, well, let's see how far I can get without needing, you know, a college degree, or, you know, in some cases, some specific, you know, certifications. I do have Security Plus. My good friend Bert Carroll made me get that at one of my previous roles. But you know, it's definitely been, it's been an interesting ride. And I have definitely seen, just over the course of my lifetime and my career, people shifting away and organizations shifting away from must have college degree, you know, and can't have the job otherwise, too. I'm seeing way more job descriptions that are, you know, college, or, you know, college degree or equivalent experience. And I think that's heartening for a lot of people who are looking to get in the space. Is, yeah, you know, you can definitely start somewhere. And as long, you know, my philosophy for hiring is, you know, I can train a lot of knowledge. What I can't train is attitude.
Yep.
And it's a lot easier to bring in people who have the right attitude, willing to learn, willing to be part of a team, than someone who might be a rock star and a genius, but is difficult to work with. Right? There's that balance that you have to kind of strike there. So, Jim and I are very much the odd couple when it comes to, at least from more reasons than one, but definitely the educational background. What about yourself, Ken? What are you seeing?
You know, it's pretty typical with both what you all said. I mean, I've seen, both people with no academic education, with, you know, lots of experience, great people with certifications to back it up. I have a combination of both. And honestly, when I was in high school, I studied auto mechanics. I wanted to be a Formula One engineer, right? My first job out of high school, I changed oil. I changed oil and washed cars at a car dealership here. And I went to community college for a mechanical engineering degree. And my first math class, I failed it. I was like, yeah, you know, maybe engineering isn't the best for me. And then I joined the Marine Corps, and I ended up getting a bachelor's and a master's while I was in the Marine Corps, more from peer pressure with the other people I lived with. They were all getting their degrees, and the Marine Corps was paying for it. So I was like, hey, you know, why not? You know, and actually that was one of the main things my parents said. You know, I don't care what you're going to do with your life, but at least have a college degree so you can fall back on it. So that was like, you know, my upbringing. But it's interesting to see the research done in cybersecurity academics, in that, you know, if you want to think about like a pipeline perspective, right, where you're training the future workforce, from an academic perspective, the majority of cybersecurity programs start off as masters, and then they slowly kind of funnel down into bachelor's programs. But there's actually a cybersecurity curriculum from a consortium of ACM and IEEE that cover pretty much the same domains of the CISSP. And within that, and again, another interesting point is that, you know, identity and access management, it seems to be always included somewhere in some type of cybersecurity training, but it's never like at the forefront. But I think, in my mind, and you guys, you can tell me if you feel the same way. Today it seems more important than everything, in, you know, not just not just in companies, but if you think about a customer experience perspective, right? If you're thinking user experience as a consumer myself, I'm going to go buy something, you know, if I have a horrible experience logging in, if I have a horrible experience, you know, trying to get information, right? That's an identity and access management challenge. And I noticed that as a consumer. Also, you know, seeing how companies implement MFA, and how some may do SMS, some may do an app. You know, a a lot now seem to be adopting WebAuthn, but it definitely seems like it's a growing user experience issue also. I mean, have y'all seen the same thing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's something that has changed over the course of, like I said, our own lives as we've gone through this. I do see, if, I think I probably would have stuck with school if there had been, the cybersecurity first approach that was out there. I mean, I had some IT classes, and I was frankly over those IT classes already, but wasn't allowed to test out. And it was like, that was kind of disheartening. It's like, okay, well, I've already built a computer when I was 8 years old, right? But I don't need to know how to run DOS, because I'm already running programs and things like that. But if there had been something that was more specific to information security, that probably would have helped me out and stick with the college side of things. And, every once in a while, I get the itch, and, I'll look on, the subreddit for, hacking or whatever it may is. There's a lot of good information, out there, and watch videos and things like that just to see how things are done, to understand it. And I've taken more the role of, more on the strategy side of things, so less fingers on keyboards, but you do have to know that kind of thing. So however you get that exposure, I think is good. And there are certainly different ways that you can prove that out for people who are prospective, employers. So I think of things like certifications on the identity management side. There's Identity Management Institute. They have several that are out there, and we've had Henry Bagdasarian on the show before, and there's a lot of work they're doing on that. I know that the ID Pro organization is working on one right now, and that'll be something to look forward to, hopefully later this year, as something that people can kind of take back. But yeah, I think there has been a shift towards more information security focused. I don't know if I've seen specific identity focused at the academic level. It's usually a component, right, somewhere of information security. And frankly, I think some people, they get away with just being dangerous enough, right? They just know enough to be dangerous and kind of understand it. And unless you're truly specializing in identity and access management, there are so many more other ways that you could take an information security approach. And I think that's where some of these other certifications and other kind of training programs are helpful to kind of demonstrate that. And frankly, a lot of it comes with experience too, right? Just understanding what works in the real world and going from there. Jim, what are your thoughts?
I think my thoughts, first off, on what Ken was saying about, identity often being your first touch point with an organization is right on. It led me to thinking about, this whole topic of workforce planning, which is that you need folks at different levels, right? You need that strategy view. But a lot of times when you get to that level within your organization or that level within your career, you lose touch with like how to get onto the screen and actually make things happen, right? And so when I think about workforce planning, it's what are all the layers, what are all the specialties that I need to put together? And it is probably not that much different with IAM than it is with any other discipline within the organization. But with that context or with that in mind, Ken, how should organizations be approaching the workforce planning? Is it only something that big organizations need to do? And then specifically within that, like, how should they go about approaching workforce planning?
Yeah. I mean, workforce planning it's definitely a challenge. Resources available. I mean, specifically in cybersecurity. Yeah, I mentioned the NIST NICE framework. So that is actually it's the go-to resource within the federal government. But again, it is a public-private project. So they actually, if you go to the NIST NICE website, and I can share the link with you, you can see information tailored for private organizations, for companies. You'll see tailored information for educators. So how can you build cybersecurity education programs around NIST NICE? If you're a company, how can you write job descriptions where you have a fairly high degree of certainty you'll find who you're looking for? And actually, the NIST NICE, they just published a new version that's more flexible than the first version. So I had mentioned, NIST NICE had defined work roles. The second version now is more flexible in that you can kind of build your own roles based on common skills. So it's kind of like a plug and play type thing. And I think that was one of the challenges with the first version. So for example, there was 7 categories that aligned with the cybersecurity framework, if you're familiar with the cybersecurity framework, so that you could build your team based on the security methodology you're trying to implement. And I think that's a great idea. You know, it's I'm someone that likes seeing alignment, you know, like it kind of makes sense. So definitely from a workforce planning perspective, you know, don't only work with your executives, but also work with your architects and your engineers who are actually implementing it. You know, I think it's fairly common that, you know, you pass your requirements along to an HR person, and then they put them up. Nothing on an HR person's fault. They're doing their job fantastically. But sometimes, you know, you submit for something, you know, submit for a specific skill that you need, and sometimes you don't always get it. So I think it's a collaboration within your organization to make sure that you're hiring the people and the skills that you need. So Jeff, I mean, you had mentioned, you know, some of the workforce models and architectures also. ID Pro in their body of knowledge, I think, is a fantastic starting point for anyone who wants to learn more about identity and access management. So specifically why I focused or scoped my work or my research to the US federal government is they had, so the Obama administration, they wrote a federal cybersecurity workforce strategy in 2016. It had 4 initiatives in it, and one of them was actually to implement the NIST NICE. So that's, you know, that's clear public information. I can see, you know, direction of an organization. If we're talking reference architectures to implement identity and access management, you have the federal identity, credential, and access management architecture. So within that, there's 5 identity service areas. And at least what I plan to do with my research is map work roles back to the reference architecture. So pretty much the same alignment that you would have if you implemented the cybersecurity or the cybersecurity framework and the NIST NICE roles. You could have the same thing in that you're trying to implement the specific identity architecture and you're looking for specific skill sets to implement it. From looking around and just my personal knowledge, I haven't found any kind of public available identity reference architectures. And it's possible I'm just not, you know, looking in the right places. I mean, can you all think of any, or have you used identity reference architectures in the past that you could recommend?
Yeah, I think it's something that is generally, it's almost too generic, I think, for some organizations, because it's who has access to what, right? And it's, here are your actors, here are the data points and the systems that they're going to get access to, and what are the workflows between them. And then you try to layer on top of it, what are the technologies that assist with whatever it may be. I don't know if there is necessarily a reference architecture that is handy, for lack of a better word, right? I mean, they're all pretty much the same thing. I know that, you know, for some of the work that Jim and I do, right, we have some of those details as we go into it. But usually when we're working in an organization, the reference architecture is really only the first part of it, right? It's okay, how do we make this specific to our organization? Because every organization is different, right? You may have Active Directory, you may not, right? We've worked with organizations that don't have AD. Somehow they get along, they have LDAP, and they have other ways to get around, you know, having that common directory. And they may have hundreds of applications, or, you know, only a few, or be in the cloud, or be on-prem only. I think the concept probably makes sense, but I don't know if you know, beyond that, how helpful it truly is in the real world. But again, that's just my opinion. Jim, do you have any thoughts on it?
You know, they've got some documents over at the Identity Defined Security Alliance. They've kind of defined a framework, but I don't know that it necessarily would qualify as a reference architecture. But I think it's a great starting point for anybody who's doing research, especially in the corporate environment, doing research in terms of kind of best practices and a framework for managing identity. You know, whenever we're talking about a reference architecture, my mind goes to vendor specific, because I think a lot of vendors want to put out that picture of how a reference architecture can be built around, or how an architecture can be built around their technology. So it's proprietary in that way. And I think there still can be a lot of great information gleaned from that. And then to kind of go for the non-vendor look, organizations like IDSA, ID Pro. I think those are really good starting points.
How do I mean, you've got a lot of work in front of you, Ken. So
Yeah.
is there anything that our listening audience can do to help or contribute to the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, the best contribution would be I plan to post my research as I get it done on my GitHub site. So, if you're interested in seeing how my research is going, if you want to offer comments, if you want to offer ideas, point me in directions, provide other resources. I mean, that's great. I mean, I truly believe, I'm a lifelong learner myself, and I feel like you have to be that in cybersecurity and identity access management specifically, right? And it's interesting that specific gap, right? The evolving environment is also identified in a couple of peer-reviewed studies, in that there's this duality of being an accredited program, meaning you take that point in time of what your program is to get accredited, but between that point in time and your the ongoing, how much can change. Like if we think back in the past year of what happened in cybersecurity, right? The thing right now in my mind that stands out the most is like the solar winds, and how that led to the golden salmon attacks, and the almost misunderstanding of how federated trusts work. I mean, not just to your point of accepting external identities, but also within your own architectures, like within your own organization architecture, of how Windows force trucks work, traversing the domains. I mean, I think that's how can you pack that up in a class and teach undergraduates or even graduate students that in the time that it happened.
Yeah, I think the SolarWinds attack, or what we've been calling it a Solarigate,
Yeah.
it seems like it's a little bit foreseeable, right? I mean, you have a third party that pushes software to a platform that you create a service account. I mean, I'm not saying that I foresaw it coming, but it doesn't seem like that kind of method of attack would be so unforeseen that maybe we haven't already been talking about it. But I think that's kind of human nature, right? Is sometimes you actually have to face a crisis in order to say, hey, a crisis exists.
Yeah. And I think, Ken, if you've got that GitHub link, I'll put that into the show notes so people can get to it. And I think it'll be interesting at some point, once you're done, maybe to circle back and see where you end up with this. Cause this is an area that I find interesting just for my own personal journey and, the crossroads, and decisions that I've had to make to get where I am. I know we've been running a little bit longer than we normally do. So we'll go ahead and start to close things up for this week. But before we do that, Ken, any final thoughts that you want to throw out there for the folks who are listening?
Yeah. Final thoughts. Yeah, just with dissertations, it's great to see them actually being used. So that's like my intent, that I will come up with this amazing identity access management workforce planning, and then everyone implements it, right? But yeah, I mean, it's best to see your research in practice. Not everything can be a Google, but seeing if it can help someone, that helped me sleep at night. So appreciate it, and thank you everyone listening to see who's interested in helping.
Another contribution to the overall IAM body of knowledge. So that hopefully will make it into the ID Pro one as well. Jim, how about yourself? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big takeaway for me, or that I want to make sure that people hear, because I think our podcast is listened to by IAM practitioners across the spectrum, and even people who are interested in getting into this field. You look at the three of us and how we all got into IAM, and it's different. And every week we have a different guest on, and it seems like they've got a different story about how they got into IAM. Some of us, kind of went through a certain college path. Others started on the help desk. Others joined the military and kind of found their way into this field. What I would say is that there's no one right way to do it. But if you want to get into this field, it's very possible. There are some things like certification, some education, things like that. But I think that what really will set you apart from in your career is real world opportunity or real world experience. So get those opportunities to get your foot in the door, and working on identity management projects, and then go that extra mile, work those extra hours, whatever it takes to kind of show that you actually care. Because I think what Jeff said is spot on in IAM and everything else, which is you can't teach attitude. Go in there with the right attitude, set yourself apart, be willing to go the extra mile, work the extra hours, whatever it takes, and you'll build a career in this industry.
Well, I think that's a good spot that we can close it out for this week, and I think that's all I think we've beaten this one pretty good. So we'll go ahead and call it. Don't forget Identity Management Day, April 13th, identitymanagementday.org. There will be a bunch of links in the show notes for this episode, Ken's GitHub. We'll have LinkedIn connections, for Ken, Jim, and myself. I'll have some things around ICAM and NIST NICE to make it easy for people to find. And with that, don't forget you can visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And thanks for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.